what our late sovereign, my beloved mother, the Queen, meant to us all.
In the stillness of Balmoral Castle, whispers began to spread. Whispers of a farewell unlike any the monarchy had ever seen. The Scottish retreat, long a sanctuary of reflection and privacy, carried an air of charged anticipation. King Charles, frail yet unyielding in resolve, prepared to make an announcement that would alter the very foundation of the crown. Every corridor seemed to vibrate with unease, as though the walls themselves anticipated history in the making. For generations, Balmoral had been a haven for the royal family. Now, it was being transformed into an arena where tradition and revelation were destined to collide. The frailty of a monarch. The king's physical weakness was no longer a secret to those closest to him. Each step seemed slower, his once commanding posture now burdened by the weight of years and illness. Though his voice retained a regal firmness, there was no denying the tremor that betrayed his exhaustion. Shadows of ill health clung to his presence, casting uncertainty across the monarchy. Behind closed doors, whispers about succession grew louder, though never publicly uttered. Courtiers who had devoted their lives to service knew what was coming, but dared not speak the truth aloud. The inevitability of change pressed upon every corner of Balmoral, making even routine gestures feel like rituals marking the end of an era. Secrecy like never before. At Balmoral, movement became deliberate and heavy with caution. The king had demanded an atmosphere of absolute secrecy. Servants spoke in hushed tones, each word weighed as though it might carry consequence beyond its intent. Invitations were not dispatched with pomp, but delivered quietly, selectively, and in ways that raised as many questions as they answered. Some members of the royal family received discreet summons, while others were conspicuously absent. Phones were confiscated, corridors were watched, and staff were reminded that one slip of the tongue could mean dismissal. This was not protocol in the traditional sense. It was more severe, more intentional. The very fabric of routine had been torn, replaced with a rigid silence that made clear something monumental was about to happen. The arrival of Catherine. Then came Catherine, the Princess of Wales. She did not arrive with ceremony or announcement, yet her presence shifted the atmosphere at once. To some, it seemed another ordinary duty of a devoted royal. To others, her very arrival signaled gravity, as though history had quietly chosen her. She walked with composure, not ostentation, but those who observed her felt the certainty of her importance. Catherine's role no longer seemed peripheral. It felt central, essential. Her graceful stillness told those watching that she had not come merely to attend. She had come as though summoned by destiny itself. For Balmoral, a place of reflection and privacy, her presence turned the estate into the stage of a reckoning. The trembling voice of history. When the moment came, even silence seemed burdened by expectation. King Charles sat before his family, his eyes marked by weariness, his hands trembling with age. Yet his words, though cracked with emotion, carried conviction. And then he spoke. "My last act. I name Catherine as head of state." The declaration pierced the room like thunder. Centuries of unbroken precedent shattered with a single sentence. For a man who had waited a lifetime to claim the crown, to surrender it so abruptly was unimaginable. Yet in that fragile, defiant voice, Charles had redefined the monarchy. In an instant, history was not only altered, but reborn. Shock within the family. The silence that followed was suffocating. Members of the royal family sat in disbelief, their eyes fixed on the king. Some fidgeted nervously, others stared into the distance, unwilling to meet one another's gaze. None spoke. Centuries of tradition had been upended in moments. The crown had not been promised to blood and heir, but to the woman married into the family, the woman admired by the public as a symbol of dignity and grace. The enormity of the king's decision hung heavily in the chamber, pressing upon every heart present. In that instant, the monarchy's future was rewritten, and no one knew what would come next. Catherine, as the chosen figure for Charles, the decision reflected both frailty and clarity. He saw in Catherine the qualities the monarchy desperately needed to survive: compassion, loyalty, resilience, and a natural grace that resonated with the people. She had carried her role with dignity, never faltering under scrutiny, never allowing ambition to overshadow duty. She was unburdened by scandal, untainted by arrogance, and able to connect with the public in ways that transcended protocol. To Charles, her ascension was not a break with tradition, but a renewal of it, a bridge between history and the future. Catherine represented not just survival, but redemption, the silent rage of Camilla. Yet for Queen Camilla, the moment was devastating. She sat frozen, her lips drawn tightly, her eyes unable to mask disbelief and humiliation. Decades of loyalty, years of resilience through scandal and whisper had culminated in this: being cast aside. The king's words stripped from her not only recognition, but the legacy she believed she had earned. The betrayal came not from the press, not from critics, but from her husband's own lips. Fury burned beneath her grief, tempered only by the knowledge that silence was her only shield in that room. The wound was personal, intimate, and irrevocable. William's conflicted heart. Prince William felt a storm unlike any other. Raised his entire life to inherit the throne, he now watched as his wife was placed above him. Pride for Catherine swelled in his heart. He had always known her worth, but pride was pierced by a quiet devastation. Would history remember him as sovereign, or as consort to the chosen queen? The foundations of his destiny seemed to collapse beneath him, leaving confusion in their wake. William's love for Catherine was unwavering, but the burden of uncertainty weighed heavily. In his silence, the air between joy and displacement grew unbearably tense. The shadow of Diana. Though never spoken, Diana's presence filled the room. Her memory hovered like a ghost, her legacy impossible to ignore. To many, Charles's decision seemed a silent tribute to her, a continuation of the compassion she had once embodied. Catherine, in her rise, appeared to fulfill what Diana had envisioned: a monarchy closer to the people, gentler in its power. Yet for William, the memory was both balm and wound. He felt the echo of his mother's suffering, the weight of her warnings. Was this act of faith from his father genuine? Or was it another maneuver designed to define his destiny from beyond the grave? Diana's shadow lingered, complicating the triumph with unspoken grief. Camilla's fear of erasure. In the days that followed King Charles's stunning declaration, whispers about Queen Camilla's reaction spread quickly through Balmoral and beyond. They said she had sat frozen as the words left her husband's lips, unable to disguise her shock. For Camilla, it was not simply a public slight, but a deeply personal betrayal. After decades of reshaping her image, weathering relentless scrutiny, and carving out a place as consort, she now faced the prospect of being remembered as little more than a footnote. The humiliation was not born of gossip or public opinion. It was sharper than that. It came from the one man whose loyalty she had trusted most. Once again, she found herself in the role she thought she had escaped: the outsider, eclipsed first by the ghost of Diana, and now by Catherine's living presence. Shifting loyalties in the household. Almost immediately, The royal household revealed its fracture lines. For years, the staff had carried themselves with unity, their loyalty aligned to the king and queen consort. But Charles's words shifted the balance overnight. Some began to speak of Catherine in hushed tones of admiration, already addressing her with a deference that suggested they saw her reign as inevitable. Others, still sympathetic to Camilla, clung to her side, though their numbers seemed to shrink by the day. For Camilla, watching loyalty evaporate so quickly was both terrifying and infuriating. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that monarchy was not only about bloodlines and ceremony, it was about perception. And perception had already crowned Catherine, Camilla's vow of defiance. Yet Camilla was not a woman to fade quietly into the background. Behind her silence, a vow burned fiercely. Whatever Charles had declared, she would not allow herself to be erased from the story. Her defiance would not come in loud rebellion or reckless gesture. She understood too well how fragile the monarchy could be when challenged from within. Instead, her resistance would be subtle, deliberate, and calculated. She had spent years surviving in shadows, navigating storms that might have destroyed others. Now, she resolved to use that same resilience to secure her place in history. If the world tried to write her out, she would find ways to make her presence endure. The nation reacts. While Balmoral simmered with unspoken rivalries, the mood outside its gates was entirely different. Across Britain, the king's announcement spread like wildfire. From the bustling streets of London to the quiet highlands of Scotland, people gathered in disbelief, awe, and exhilaration. For many, the decree was not a betrayal of tradition, but a moment of vindication. Catherine had long been admired as the people's queen in spirit, even before Charles gave her the title, in fact. She embodied a blend of grace and relatability that resonated far beyond the gilded halls of monarchy. For years, the public had quietly chosen her in their hearts. Now, with the king's final act of trust, that sentiment had been confirmed. Tears of sorrow. But the reaction was far from uniform. Among older monarchists, there was grief. Grief for the traditions broken, for the certainty of a crown passed down in an unbroken line. For generations, they had defended the stability of the monarchy, its enduring continuity through centuries of upheaval. Now they mourned not out of anger, but out of sorrow for what they saw as a fracture in that certainty. To them, the monarchy had been altered in ways they could scarcely comprehend, and their tears were shed for a sense of permanence that seemed to vanish with Charles's words. Tears of joy among younger Britons, however, the response was jubilant. Many had grown disillusioned with what they saw as the monarchy's distance and coldness, its inability to adapt to the times. Catherine's rise was to them a symbol of hope, relevance, and renewal. On social media, excitement erupted in a flood of messages celebrating her as the monarch of the future. They called her a figure who belonged to their century, one who reflected the world as they lived it. For these younger generations, Charles's decision did not weaken the monarchy. It gave it new life. A generational divide, a strange unity. The generational split in reactions created an unusual kind of unity across Britain. Though divided in perspective, whether through grief or joy, the people were bound together by recognition of a seismic shift. For older citizens, Catherine's rise felt like loss. For the young, it felt like gain. Yet both understood that the monarchy had reached a turning point, and that history had been reshaped in a way that could not be undone. In that recognition, Britain was unified not in opinion, but in awareness of the extraordinary. Catherine as a symbol of renewal. In the eyes of the nation, Catherine became more than a royal figure. She had been elevated not merely by birthright or ceremony, but by the will of a people and the final act of a king. To the older generation, she was a disruption. To the younger, she was promise. To both, she was undeniable. With her quiet dignity and steady composure, Catherine had crossed the threshold from Princess of Wales to something larger, a symbol of an era, a queen chosen not by tradition alone, but by the spirit of renewal. The people's coronation crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Chants of "Catherine, Catherine" rose like a chorus of renewal. Flags waved, flowers were laid, portraits were held aloft in a wave of devotion. It was not mourning, but rebirth, a coronation not by ceremony, but by sentiment. In Catherine, the people saw both the continuation of Diana's compassion and the beginning of something new. For them, she was not merely a chosen queen, but a symbol of the monarchy reborn. A global shockwave beyond Britain, the reaction was immediate. Foreign media declared the decision seismic, a daring break from centuries of tradition. Analysts debated the constitutional consequences, but for the wider world, the story was simpler. History had bent in real time. Catherine had become the global face of a monarchy once thought too rigid to change. For many, it was a reminder that even the oldest institutions could be remade in a single act of courage. Charles's final redemption. For King Charles, frail and weary, the decision was both an ending and a redemption. After years of scrutiny and comparison, he had entrusted the crown not to tradition, but to trust itself. His act was one of release, a final gesture of faith that the monarchy could be preserved through compassion, dignity, and renewal. Catherine, to him, was not only a successor, but a savior, the figure who could redeem what he had carried for a lifetime. Headlines. Across the globe. News outlets erupted with headlines that stunned the world. Catherine named head of state. Broadcasters dissected every word of Charles's declaration, framing it as a seismic break with tradition. Analysts debated the constitutional implications, but the public narrative was simpler. History had bent before their eyes. In homes, pubs, and public squares, conversations buzzed with disbelief and exhilaration. For millions, the announcement felt like a rebirth of hope in the monarchy. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace. In London, crowds surged outside Buckingham Palace. Thousands gathered in disbelief, their voices rising as chants of "Catherine, Catherine" echoed against the iron gates. Tears streamed down faces both young and old. People clutched portraits, waved flags, and laid flowers, not in mourning, but in celebration of renewal. For many, the parallels to Diana were unavoidable. Where Diana's story had ended in tragedy, Catherine's seemed to begin in triumph. To the people, this was not merely succession. It was redemption. William's moment of displacement. Inside Balmoral, no one felt the shift more deeply than Prince William. Raised since childhood with the knowledge that the crown would one day rest upon his head, he now found himself standing in the shadow of his wife. Catherine's worth was undeniable, and pride for her swelled in him, but it came tangled with a quiet devastation. He was the heir, the son of a king, yet not the chosen one. The roles of husband, father, and monarch-in-waiting collided within him, leaving his heart torn. As the silence stretched after his father's words, William wrestled with emotions that no crown could soothe. Love for Catherine, admiration for her strength, but also the sting of displacement. The ghost of Diana returns. William's mind, in that moment, drifted back to his mother. Diana's memory filled the room like an unseen presence. He recalled her tears, her warnings, her struggles within the institution that had both cherished and wounded her. In Catherine's sudden rise, he felt both the echo of Diana's suffering and the fulfillment of her vision. Catherine embodied the compassion Diana had championed, the bridge between crown and people she had dreamed of. Yet William feared the price that came with it. He questioned whether his father's decision was an act of genuine faith or a final maneuver to shape his destiny from beyond the throne. The mistrust that had long haunted the relationship between father and son resurfaced, whispering doubts William could not silence. Questions for the next generation. For William, the impact went beyond his own role. It reached his children. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been raised under the assumption that one day George would inherit the crown. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by a storm of questions. Would George step aside for his mother? Would the family face a battle of succession that could fracture them forever? William's heart ached at the thought of his children inheriting a monarchy already divided. Whatever storms came, he vowed silently to shield them and to ensure Catherine would never carry this burden alone. If she was the chosen one, then he would stand not behind her nor above her, but firmly at her side. Harry's explosive response. As William sat in private turmoil, another storm erupted thousands of miles away. When Prince Harry learned of his father's final act, his anger was volcanic, rising with a ferocity that few around him had ever witnessed. For Harry, this was not Catherine's triumph, but confirmation of his deepest fears, that his place, and that of his children, had been erased. For years he had carried the sting of exclusion, believing his family's branch was deliberately sidelined. Now, Charles's words crystallized those suspicions into reality. Catherine's elevation did not merely bypass William. It cut Harry's line entirely from the monarchy's living narrative. To him, this was not only succession, it was obliteration, a public erasure that cut to the bone. Meghan's voice in the storm. Beside Harry, Meghan gave voice to the wounds that burned beneath the surface. She reminded him of Diana's struggles, how Harry's mother had been sidelined, silenced, and broken within the very institution that promised her protection. Meghan saw Charles's decision not as renewal, but as repetition, a cycle in which the family's outsiders were once again written out. For Harry, the betrayal struck hardest when he looked at Archie and Lilibet. Would they grow up as outsiders forever, their lineage denied, their titles little more than empty symbols? He had always sworn his children would not carry the pain he endured, but now that dream seemed shattered. In Catherine's rise, justified though it might be in the eyes of the world, Harry saw the permanent closing of doors for his family. Across the Atlantic, a storm brews in Montecito, the fury became impossible to contain. Late-night phone calls echoed through the house, his voice raised in anguish and anger as he confided in trusted friends. He spoke of betrayal, of a monarchy determined to erase him, of a father who had chosen Catherine over his own son. His pain spilled out raw, unfiltered, unguarded. Each word was a confession, each sentence a spark. It was only a matter of time before whispers leaked across the ocean. Within days, tabloids in Britain began running headlines, quoting sources close to Harry that described him as erased, cast out, unforgiven. His fury was no longer private. It had become a storm broadcast to the world, threatening to engulf Charles's final act in scandal. A question of rebellion. The speculation came quickly and with urgency. Would Harry go further? Would he denounce the king's decision openly, in interviews or even a televised statement? Would he turn his anger into a rebellion that might fracture the monarchy irreparably? His memoir had already rattled Buckingham Palace once. shaking the institution with unvarnished truths. Another public strike, especially now, could set fire to what remained of unity. Each whispered report of his fury deepened the tension, as if the world awaited a thunderclap that could arrive at any moment. Harry, once the spare, now seemed poised to become the monarchy's most dangerous voice. Princess Anne steps forward. Amid the chaos of anger, doubt, and silence, another voice emerged from Balmoral itself, a voice steady, firm, and impossible to ignore. Princess Anne, the king's sister, stepped forward with the authority she had long embodied. Known for her devotion to service and her disdain for spectacle, Anne had always been the family's anchor. Now, as the storm grew, she lent her weight to the king's decision. Her acceptance was not one of blind loyalty, but of recognition. She had seen Catherine's composure, her strength under pressure, her quiet resilience in the face of relentless scrutiny. In Catherine, Anne recognized echoes of their mother, Elizabeth II, a monarch whose dignity and restraint had defined an era. Anne's words gave Charles's decree the legitimacy it desperately needed. Anne as the bridge. Anne's acceptance carried more than royal duty. It carried balance. Where Camilla's fury festered and William's doubts threatened instability, Anne's calm steadiness built a bridge between a dying king's wish and the fractured family left behind. She did not diminish the weight of the shock, nor did she deny the disruption of tradition. Instead, she cast her support as a practical recognition of character. Catherine's elevation, Anne made clear, was not a whim, but a deliberate act rooted in trust. By standing with her brother's decision, Anne provided a stabilizing force, reminding the family and the public that continuity could still exist, even amid change. A nation's divided heartbeat. Beyond Balmoral's gates, Britain itself was processing the shock with emotions as divided as they were intense. For older monarchists, the decision felt like the breaking of a sacred chain, a disruption of tradition that had endured through centuries of storms. They mourned not in anger, but in sorrow, weeping for the certainty of a crown that passed unshaken from heir to heir. For younger citizens, however, the moment was exhilarating. Catherine was not just a royal figure, she was theirs. On social platforms, excitement surged. Posts hailed her as the queen of a modern monarchy, a leader who finally reflected the values of a 21st century Britain. And yet, in this division, there was a strange unity. Whether through tears of joy or tears of grief, the nation was bound together by recognition of a moment too profound to ignore. The global response. The shockwaves did not stop at Britain's borders. Across the world, the announcement made headlines that captured its seismic nature. Catherine named head of state, blared newspapers from Europe to Asia. In America, commentators called it the most daring royal decision in living memory. Analysts debated the constitutional implications, some worrying about instability, others admiring the boldness. Yet to the wider public, the meaning was simpler. History had bent before their eyes. Catherine's name became a global symbol of renewal, her rise seen as proof that even the oldest institutions could transform in the blink of an eye. The people's coronation back in London, the emotional swell reached its peak. Outside Buckingham Palace, thousands gathered. The chants began softly. Catherine, Catherine, but quickly rose into a chorus of devotion. Flags waved in the evening air, portraits of the Princess of Wales were lifted high, and tears streamed freely down faces young and old. This was not mourning, nor mere celebration. It was coronation, not one conducted with scepters and orbs, but one shaped by the voices of the people themselves. For many, The echoes of Diana were unmistakable. Catherine seemed the continuation of what Diana had promised, a softer, more human monarchy that could bridge the distance between palace and people. Where Diana's story had ended in tragedy, Catherine's seemed to begin in rebirth. Camilla's lonely silence. Yet within Balmoral's walls, one figure sat in silence, her fury unspoken but heavy in the air. For Queen Camilla, this moment was not triumph but ruin. To her, history was already rewriting her place, not as a partner in Charles's reign, but as a shadow eclipsed, first by Diana's memory, now by Catherine's rise. The humiliation was not only public, but intimate. She had stood by Charles for decades, only to find herself written out by his final act. Though she vowed quietly to resist erasure, Camilla understood the truth she could not admit aloud. In a monarchy built as much on image as law, perception was power. And perception had already crowned Catherine. Charles's final redemption. For Charles himself, frail and weary, the decision was both a farewell and a redemption. His reign, though brief, had been marked by scrutiny, comparison, and endless debate about whether he could live up to the legacy of his mother. But in choosing Catherine, he found a release. It was an act of faith, a gesture that sought not only to preserve the monarchy, but to renew it. He entrusted its survival to compassion, dignity, and grace embodied in a woman who had never faltered. To Charles, Catherine was not simply his successor. She was his final gift to the crown, and his last chance to be remembered not as a placeholder monarch, but as the king who gave the monarchy a future. Conclusion. The Crown Rewritten. What unfolded at Balmoral was far more than a family drama. It was the rewriting of history in the twilight of a reign, a coronation disguised as farewell. Charles's decree fractured loyalties and reignited rivalries. It ignited Harry's fury, unsettled William's destiny, and stung Camilla with humiliation. Yet it also brought unity in division, renewal in grief, and hope in uncertainty. Across Britain and far beyond, people recognized that they had witnessed not only the end of a reign, but the beginning of something new. Catherine, once the Princess of Wales, now stood as the chosen figure of a new age. Whether embraced with joy or resisted in sorrow, her rise bound a nation together in recognition of a moment that would echo across generations.